One such piece is entitled The Enigma of Isidore Ducasse, dating from 1920. The photo depicts a cloth tied around a mysterious object. Man Ray published this photo of a sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissecting table in 1933. It was a theme which interested Ray, the juxtaposition of unrelated objects, when normality encounters another normality and engenders surprise, astonishment, and a new, unfamiliar kind of beauty. The painting of the billiard table and colored clouds dates from 1938, as we can see from the signature. Man Ray called it La Fortune, meaning luck or wealth. The title could refer to the scene in the picture, as well as provide a key to its interpretation. It may equally be regarded as a disconnected phrase, lending the picture and the objects it shows an unusual, peculiar air. It is left open. Either way, the meaning is obscure. And it is this obscurity which prevents the picture from ossifying into one particular interpretation. The picture should be viewed with the eyes, and not by means of reason and logic. This is why its conception is at once so simple and yet so contradictory. Everything grates against everything else. Nothing can be pinned down to a single interpretation. There is the deserted landscape with its brownish tinge and the peculiar stripes. It is unclear what they represent. There is the slope of the table, ignoring the perspectives of the landscape, the way it explodes the depiction of reality used since the Renaissance. The slope, which should have caused the billiard balls to roll off the edge. But they remain fixed there, defying all logic. Then there is the thick table leg. It casts a shadow, as if to say, everything is not as it should be, although the details are still true. Finally, there are the brightly colored clouds, floating calmly across the sky, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. A breathtaking, humorous touch, which defies categorization. And yet, the colors are still presented in the order of the artist's palette. Because it seems as if everything is in order, we begin to ask ourselves, why not? Why not the unexpected, the absurd, with all its poetry? Man Ray himself made a number of comments on the picture, but little can be gleaned from them by way of interpretation, although they say a lot about his attitude to his work. I purposefully distorted the perspective of the table, so it would appear as large as a meadow. The green table reminds me of a meadow. I always wanted to have a billiard table in my garden in the country. I didn't want to paint anything realistic or descriptive. Behind every one of my pictures is an idea. It is the idea which interests me, not the representation. The idea of the painting is a proclamation. It proclaims the independence of the imagination. It is a declaration of man's right to madness, imagination and madness as an alternative reality, as real and consistent as normality. As consistent as this simple painting, it achieves its simplicity by not seeking to hide behind the bravura of technique.
Just before the First World War, Cubism became the international style of the avant-garde, though Cubist pictures didn't normally carry titles like An Englishman in Moscow. The artist was the Russian Kazimir Malevich, and looking closely, it seems as though Malevich is telling us a story, or perhaps taking us on a journey, an Englishman's journey through Moscow, and what the artist imagines such an Englishman might notice about the city in these days when the Russian Revolution is already threatening. Curious, unrelated things that come together in his mind like a scrapbook or collage, collage being among the inventions of the founders of Cubism, Picasso and Braque. But what is it all about? What does it add up to, this kaleidoscope through which plunges almost savagely a red arrow? Step back, and the arrow seems less menacing, more like a formal sash worn across the chest of this smartly dressed Englishman in a top hat. We notice other things more. A red spoon by his head, fragments of lettering like torn newspaper headlines, and a great white fish half obscuring the man's face. Can he really have been confronted by a fish on his travels through Moscow? All is mystery. Maybe the scissors have cut out the lettering, an advertisement for a horse race. Englishmen like racing. But then, more prominent, are the syllables zamenya, meaning solar eclipse. And lower down, another jumble of letters, chastichnoya, meaning partial, so partial solar eclipse. Here it has to be said that the Englishman has got thoroughly lost in Moscow. This is not a journey with any direction. Perhaps the way to approach this painting is to see only the style as Cubist, not the content. There is no pictorial coherence. You cannot read it as you can read a true Cubist picture. It's not supposed to make sense in that way. So does it make nonsense? In a way, yes, and in the same way it is meant to be. Malevich at this time was beginning his search for a kind of painting which compelled the viewer to look for a meaning separate from the recognizable world outside. He called this system displacement, an overturning of accepted logic. It was a kind of shock to the complacent eye. He owed much of this revolutionary thinking to a fellow Russian, Kandinsky, at that time working in Munich. Kandinsky's painting called Lady in Moscow may well have prompted the title of Malevich's own picture a year or two later. More than this, it was Kandinsky who preached that images possessed an inner sound, independent of the real world, just as music is. The true role of the modern artist lay in releasing this inner sound. So, where are we then? Presented with this jumble of images laid one upon another. What is their inner sound, their inner meaning supposed to be? The red arrow worn like a sash, fragments of words, a curved Russian sword, a candle, a ladder, and this great white fish dangling between a postcard scene of Moscow and our English tourist, whose eye, apparently, is what takes all these images in. The title, An Englishman in Moscow, suggests that here is a visual scrapbook of things observed by this foreigner's eye. But it can't be only this. Or why the fish? And why should a beam of light shine from it? A beam of light from a fish? The fish, what's more, obscures one half of the man's face. Maybe there's a strange connection here with those fragmentary words which, when put together, read partial solar eclipse. Here are clues enough to suggest that the inner meaning of the painting may lie in the realm of symbolism. If we pursue this line of thought, then the image here of a Russian Orthodox church becomes significant. The central tradition of Russian painting is that of the church icon, and the experience of an icon is a mystical one. We glimpse divine truths through the operation of symbols. A later painting by Malevich, Peasant's Head, much more obviously belongs to the tradition of the Russian icon, the peasant as Christ. From this point of view, the candle acquires a poignant meaning too, a traditional symbol of spiritual light. The fish as well, symbol of Christ, fisher of men. The painting begins to divide in two, good and evil forces, the light and the dark. Hence Malevich's partial solar eclipse written across it. On the side of goodness, the candle, ladder, fish, spoon. On the side of evil, cutting tools, the scissors, and various weapons. The long curved sword, the jagged saw in the background. Now when you stand back, the whole painting does seem to divide into strong areas of contrasting light and dark. And if this represents a division between good and evil, the Englishman comes out none too well. He's definitely on the dark side, with his black top hat and sombre suit and tie, and yet only one half of him. The other half is the Christ symbol, dazzlingly white, the fish. So good is half eclipsed by evil. The same is true of the church. The light is not sunlight, it comes from different directions. Again, the precise division, the partial eclipse. Even the eye. Malevich has given us a puzzling modern icon, and here one may risk a leap. Malevich was on the way to freeing his paintings of all references to natural images. He was halfway there, a partial eclipse of the old world of copying nature. A brave new world lay ahead of him in which experience could be conveyed in some kind of abstract essence. He's already come a long way. Only 2 years earlier, he was painting subjects taken from village life, heavily influenced by Matisse. Heavy forms, blocks of colour, the signature as solid as his figures. Within 5 years, 1915, he was painting uncompromisingly black square on white background. And in the same year, 8 rectangles, which Malevich entitled suprematist painting. For him, the purest representation of forces and emotions soaring into imaginary space. Then, in 1917, a hint at an icon without figures, a focus of meditation, white cross. 1917, of course, was the year of the Russian Revolution. Before long, these brave experiments fell foul of the Soviet propaganda machine. The mysterious picture in which Malevich seems to express this tussle between good and evil became in a sense prophetic. The eclipse became total. Fortunately for the West, in 1927, Malevich presented a great many of his pictures to a German architect friend. And in 1958, these became sold to the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. Today, this is the richest single collection of the artist's work anywhere. In the Wingbeat of the Swans, an evocative title. But first the size, almost 7 feet high, nearly 10 feet across. We have to imagine it to be much bigger than we are. The artist is Asger Jorn, born in Denmark in 1914, lived here in Amsterdam for some time, though mainly in Paris. He painted this in 1963. Let's isolate a few details first to see if there are any clues. The merest suggestion of a face, 2 small eyes, and a mouth screaming. Black brushstrokes wrapped round it like a scarf. You'd be hard put to it to find an image here. Or is that another face? A pair of eyes, yellow nose, nostrils? There's a hint of a landscape here, a sunken lane. overhanging branches, deep shadows. But then in the centre, isn't that an eye? As if some creature's lurking there, peering. And this, another eye? It's easy to be led astray, perhaps, and see what's not there. Nonetheless, there are hints that we're looking at an inhabited jungle of the artist's mind, and the painting may not be as entirely abstract as we first imagined. There's a suggestion of fantasy breaking through, a suggestion, besides, of movement. And here the title is a signpost to the way we might look at it, in the wing beat of the swans. The shapes that predominate are these dark, heavy brushstrokes from which the paint drips, silhouettes against the bright light behind them. They form a sequence of sharp curves, like wings swept back in a flight of birds. And the hot colours behind create the impression of sunset, nature on fire. An apocalyptic vision, which in colour and dramatic contrast is reminiscent of an earlier Scandinavian artist, Edvard Munch. The same sense of natural forces echoing man's terrors and passions, a troubled mirror of our dreams. Swans are white, yet in northern mythology they are also harbingers of doom, so they combine daylight and darkness, life and death. The painting is built on this contrast between powerful dark shapes and the livid colours around them, with in both cases the paint fluid, dripping. The symbolism is vague. The tussle between dark and light forces is never enacted with clear images, but with evocative brushstrokes in the manner often labelled by art critics abstract expressionist. 50 years earlier, the painter Kandinsky had tried to establish the principles underlying this kind of subjective painting. A work of art, Kandinsky wrote, is born of the artist in a mysterious and secret way. It has power to create a spiritual atmosphere, and from this internal standpoint alone can one judge whether it is a good work of art or a bad. In other words, there can be no objective standards. We can only explore our own reactions, aided by what we know to have been the artist's intentions and preoccupations. Because even intuitions need guidelines if we're not to get hopelessly lost. There's a wildness about these shapes and colours, a stark, almost brutal quality, which carries with it a suggestion of primitive energies, untamed passions. It's a world of subconscious fantasy, expressed not in concrete images, but in an unruly tussle of colour and line. Jorn was fascinated all his life with Nordic myths and the forces of magic contained within those myths, hence the evocative title, In the Wing Beat of the Swans. And he believed that the layers of the human subconscious offered links with the experience of those forces. Or to put it another way, painting becomes a way of releasing the demons. There were always demons inhabiting the world of Asger Jorn. In this early painting, they have more obvious faces and grimaces. Eyes peer out at us from a jungle of bodies. The sinister and the cheerful go hand in hand. It's hard to know on what level to respond. His preoccupation is very evidently with the human beast. Jorn wrote in 1950, "We should not give descriptions of man as an animal. We should describe ourselves as animals." Even earlier, 1945, the faces stand clear of the swirling lines of paint. Again, part comic. But the human beast is also a hybrid, half plant, some kind of creeper. Nordic myth is always the source, though the title here is simply personage. He was a painter of fertile fantasy, and the vigour of his inventions forbids any decline into mere whimsy. In the North, he said, we're not merely at the cold margins of civilization, but of existence too, life itself, a naked landscape of the imagination. In fact, the north itself, where Asger Jorn grew up, became a place of memory after his early move to Paris in the 30s. But from time to time he returned to refresh his links with Nordic lands and Nordic myth, his world of fantasy by now tinged by contact with surrealism, whose practitioners he got to know in Paris. In the 1950s, he even invented a portrait of one of the pioneers of the surrealist movement, the poet Guillaume Apollinaire, who had died during the First World War. Characteristically, a portrait part affectionate, part Humpty Dumpty. Apollinaire as a robust creature of myth. By the 1960s, and the painting we began with, the masks and the grimacing figures have all but disappeared. Even the curious signs and symbols have given way to a much freer exploration of colour and movement. The movement of the swan's wing beats, which are never described, only suggested by the shapes that sweep across the canvas. Jorn's naked landscape of the imagination, as he put it. It assaults the eye with the colours of Edvard Munch and the attack we associate with American abstract painters, who were making such an impact on European art at that time. The vigour of these late paintings is almost explosive, and the theme of the mythical swan pervades a great many of them. As If the Swans Are Singing, he entitled this one, a reminder that in classical myth, the bird was a lover of music and thought to utter a beautiful song before its death. If Jorn had lived 1,000 years ago, said a close friend, he would have been a wandering teller of sagas. More to the point, maybe, is whether abstract painting is a vehicle capable of bearing the weight and meaning of myth. Does the paint convey myth or lose it? And does it matter? Fascination for Nordic mythology may have been of more crucial importance to Jorn than it is to the viewer of his work. Like a musician, his sources lie hidden behind what he creates. And as with this painting in the year of his death, few artists have filled the canvas with so much vibrancy and raw strength. It's as though he painted with the very elements of nature. His colours, his lines, even the haphazard flow and drip of paint seem to express the energy and power of natural forces. And it was these forces, of course, which for him were the ingredients of myth, legends born out of man's wonder and fear of nature. Asger Jorn died in 1970 at the age of 56. There are more things in a picture, he said, than in a heaven of aesthetic theory. Abstract painting is sometimes, not always, a distilling of experiences of the world about us, though to seek recognizable images of that familiar world may prove a futile task. So it is with this fugitive veil of a picture by the Dutch-born American painter Willem de Kooning, done in 1983 when the artist was approaching 80. Even looking at it for less than a minute, one is aware of a wind-blown freshness, of a feeling of airiness, light, and the movement of things observed and caught with an elegant flick of the brush. Nothing is recognizable. The closer we peer, the further we seem to be from anything we can actually identify. We are aware only of marks as light and swift as the track of a skate across ice, and of colors rarer than the expanses of white that lie between. De Kooning once said that even abstract shapes must have a likeness. He didn't mean a likeness of any specific image, but rather an echo of sensations we may recognize. In this case, of movement and sunlight, fleeting forms in the wind, reflections. The title, Mourning the Springs, refers to where the artist painted it, at his home on Long Island. Everything flows, floats. The forms seem weightless, transparent. sometimes edged in blue like a shadow, or the leading of a stained glass window. Much of the painting is monochrome, though in the lower centre a form stands out in cool, strong yellow, anchoring the picture. It's ambiguous like everything else, but the colour suggests a splash of early sunlight,